Well, I'd like to actually begin by asking a question about this painting, to start thinking about the kinds of links that might be made between art, contingency, and the development of mackerel as a form of economic currency. And we can add a death in there, because there will be some on the way. So we can make that 4 things. And the question concerns what kind of life was necessary to lead to the production of a painting such as this, of a packet of mackerel. Can we see anything of that life in the artwork itself? Because in his writings about painting, Merleau-Ponty argues that although it is certain that a person's life does not explain his work, it is equally certain that the two are connected. The truth is that that work to be done called for that life. So what kind of life is necessary to produce art? Now this is a very famous painting of Van Gogh's Wheat Field of Crows, and it's partly famous because John Berger reproduces this on page 27 of Ways of Seeing. And you turn the page, and on page 28, Van Gogh says, this is the last painting Van Gogh did before he killed himself. It is hard to define exactly how the words have changed the image, but undoubtedly they have. The image illustrates the sentence. So the question is, can we see Van Gogh's suicidal consciousness in the painting in the same way we can see his body? So, for example, can we see the physiology of his elbow and the movement of his elbow in the way that we can see it in his body? Can we see that? Can we see anything of his mind in his painting? So, can we see the shape and state of his consciousness before he walked into these same fields with a shotgun and shot himself in the chest? Does the painting carry any of these traces? That's the kind of question I'd like to ask. In fact, the far less portentous cottages with fat thatched roofs or this garden are more likely to have been Van Gogh's final paintings. So this painting, Wheatfield, may have been painted as much as 2 weeks before his suicide, leaving us to wonder if it's the mythology and imagination that surrounds this painting that's wholly constructing the portent of the picture. So such it is when we return to this painting of Macrel, we have to ask a similar kind of question. What sort of life would lead someone to choose, out of all the subjects, objects and infinite possibilities in the world, to paint packets of mackerel? What would a human being have to live in order to produce such a work? And if we think in terms of Levi-Strauss's work on art as a kind of process of making, in which the meaning is located not so much in the final content, but in the act, the effort of dedicating oneself to representing an object, why would somebody dedicate so much time and effort and patience in reproducing this picture when in an era in which we have digital cell phones and cameras, this is a photograph and this is the painting of the thing. Why would a human being bother to go to the point, and what goes on in the mind of somebody who painted it? So it's a piece by a New York-based artist called Bill Cullen, this piece of mackerel. And perhaps to begin with, we can start with referencing the ontic certainty of the artwork itself, its status as something that exists in the world. That's something we're sure of. And then we can think about how it might be part of someone's life and expand out from there. And this is drawing on ideas from Heidegger. So in Heidegger's famous example of the hammer, he speaks about how a hammer doesn't make sense on its own. No object makes sense on its own. A hammer only makes sense in relation to the nail. But even the hammer and nail makes no sense, because what's it for? You're hammering it into wood. But even that makes no sense without understanding the purpose of that action. Maybe you're hammering it into wood because of shelter, which tells you about the human organism and its need to be sheltered from the elements and so forth. And so from that we build up, in a Heideggerian sense, a picture of the society. So I'd like to ask a question: what kind of society, therefore, can we construct from this image of Macrel? What kind of society, in its kind of social, political and moral values, might emerge from this painting? At its most basic level, Bill Cullum's series of paintings of Macrel can be understood as an aggregation of colour and materiality through which meaning is produced. But beyond this, unless there's anyone in this room can tell me the reasons for this presence in the world, something soon becomes apparent, and that is, it exposes the uncertain relationship between perception, language, knowledge and materiality. So this is a contingent relationship. There's no determinative relationship that's going on here. And in fact, this painting is among a number of artworks made by persons who are confronting their own mortality. That is to say, artists with HIV and AIDS who I've collaborated with since the late 90s, both in New York and in Uganda. And we can use the kind of material ontic presence of these paintings in order to examine the necessary conditions and limiting factors that make possible an imagined mutuality of the world. That is, mutuality of the world, a sense of living and dwelling with other persons who experience and understand and imagine the world in a similar fashion. Perhaps, for example, through the experience of long-term illness, or persons that are confronting their own non-existence and are aware of that, or perhaps a kind of being towards death. We might, for example, trace traces of people's perceptions of time and space through artworks, and that's what I do in a kind of longer version of this paper. We might try and think about how cycles of illness and recovery might emerge within artworks. We might think about somebody's embodied consciousness in the final days before death. So mutuality, here defined in relation to the making of material artifacts, offers a basis for understanding the possibility or otherwise of intersubjectivity. It's a way of thinking about not only the commonalities that exist between persons, but also where do the hermeneutic borders lie? Where are the borders of intersubjectivity that we cannot transcend? What are the limits of these things? So, yes, there's a notion, a phylogenetic basis of shared perception and cognition and action when experiencing things like illness. But what does it mean to have a radically unstable body and to confront the challenge of still producing art in those moments? If so, we might also use Macrel to demonstrate the ways in which notions of epistemology and ontology are continually challenged by the specificity of persons with their changing moods, emotions, half-formed thoughts, inchoate streams of thinking, idiosyncratic bodily experiences of the world, and so forth. In other words, if we need to understand the complexity and indeterminacy of the human condition, we need to open up a space where we can discuss the contingency of people's bodies and being, so as to move beyond the universality of anthropos and the diversity of ethnos, and reinstate people to their own life histories, their own bodies, their own imaginations, if only because the figure of the person, or the human, overcomes the epistemological division between biology and culture. Or to put it another way, a person incorporates both, and thereby offers a way of understanding human action beyond established disciplinary divisions, for example, between literature and science, or biology and puppetry. We can think about how a person can transcend those different ways of thinking. So, by focusing on the circumstances of an artwork's bodily production and the material forms that subsequently come into being, I argue that we can investigate lived experiences of time, space and body in ways that recognise their specificity and diversity and alterity, but do not marginalise or reduce individual discrepancies. Now, such an approach to the specific bodily basis of art was one of Merleau-Ponty's major concerns when he argued for evidence of Paul Cézanne's ongoing trouble with his eyes could be found in the landscapes that he painted. The painter takes his body with him, Paul Valery said a long time ago. And indeed, we cannot imagine how a mind on its own could paint. It is only by lending one's body to the world that the artist changes the raw material of light, colour and texture into paintings. So to understand such transformations of light and so forth, we must go back to the working of the actual body, not as a chunk of space, not as a social construct or a bundle of functions, but as the movement of limbs, of the intertwining of vision and imagination, and as something that is predicated on a particular life history and existential perception, on a particular kind of body. And as such, in this paper, I want to use the existence of painting as a material basis to begin speaking about the relationship between an artwork, the economics and circulation of Macrel, money, and the existential life circumstances that led to its production. I also want to explore the relationship between disease, incarceration and imagination, and people's artistic and imaginative productions while they live with a sick or confined and sometimes radically unstable body. So Bill's painting of Macrel remains ambiguous because we do not know what type of cooperation the artist is trying to elicit or who his audience might be. So epistemological uncertainty, doubt and scepticism emerge, and difficult questions arise about how artistic intentions and substance intertwine. For although the physiology and movement of Bill's body can be seen in his painting, we cannot the same for his psychological condition, his life history or his consciousness. So it brings us back again to these same annoying questions about the limits of intersubjectivity and how we might access or reconcile human experience with an artwork's expressive exteriority that's present for the eye. What constitutes evidence? What ontological status can we accord the viewer's interpretations? In this sense, this is the audience here. So the interpretations you're making at this moment, what kind of ontological status can we accord them? You know, how do they relate or otherwise to truth? What is the status of people's imaginative reconstructions? For rather than provide a reliable material witness to the painter's embodied mental state, this painting is a highly unreliable witness, and it only raises further questions about evidence and content and so forth. Now, I first got to know Bill in the late 90s when I was doing my PhD, which, as Angela kind of gestured towards, was trying to understand the consciousness of people close to death. So how does the world appear to people close to death? What happens to perceptions of time, nature, social relations, religion, those kinds of things. And one of the ways I started thinking about this was through people's artistic productions. Another way I started thinking about this was through the use of Nietzsche's notion of eternal return, or perhaps it was a misunderstanding of Nietzsche's eternal return. So for Nietzsche, there's if eternity exists, if time goes on forever and ever and ever and ever, then repetitive patterns emerge. So that the more of eternity is, the more likely something is to reoccur again, even down as a kind of thought experiment to the particular configuration of atoms and molecules in this room that constitutes our own individual consciousnesses. So as a kind of thought experiment, this moment may return, because if eternity goes on forever, this particular arrangement of molecules may well return. And so Nietzsche's using this as a kind of way of thinking about the moral quality or value to our lives, to our particular moments. So if this is the moment in which all the past refers to, so everything that's happened in the past has culminated in this particular moment in time. Everything that happens is this moment. And then everything that's going to happen in the future, it comes out from the funnel of this moment. So this particular moment is incredibly important for Nietzsche. But of course, what we do in our lives is we fritter this away. And he's suggesting that we need to go beyond our conventional habits and so forth to think about the value of our life. And if we apply this to our own kind of philosophy of being in the world, we can think of, you sit through a bad soap opera. It would be hell to sit through that one more time. But imagine eternally returning to that over and over and over again. We can imagine all kinds of aspects of our life, university administration, commuting, etc. Imagine what it would mean to return to that eternally. And this is the kind of thing that Nietzsche's getting at. And so, essentially, what I was interested in when you're working with people who are close to death was if your eternity is the next 1 year or the next 18 months, how do you spend that? What kind of quality do you do? Do you take lots of drugs? Do you spend it with friends and family? Do you go travelling and see all the places you never wanted to go? And so this became one of the really interesting questions of all these people who had been diagnosed with HIV, and thinking about, this was in the 90s, so this was when antiretroviral medications they came out in the late 90s. So thinking about, well, how would you spend your life if you were told you had 1 year to live, and so forth. And Bill always imagined he would be dead in 18 months. He called this concept the horizon of his existence. So wherever he was now, he imagined in 18 months I'll be dead. And Bill, like a lot of gay men in New York, are atheists because of the attachment of sin to homosexuality. So for Bill, death was not a boundary to be transcended into another life, but this was a limit. So how would you spend this time? What Bill decided to do was that he was going to, after attempting to go out high, which he couldn't quite manage, he decided that he was going to dedicate his life to painting. And he was in a small studio on East 14th Street, and he would go into the studio on Monday, and he would spend the whole week with his dog, Caleb, and I think was the name, and then on Friday he would come out of the studio, and then he would live a kind of social life at the weekends. And it just happened, the first time I ever met Bill was on a Friday afternoon at his studio, and so he'd been cooped up with all his artworks, his own thoughts, and his dog, only venturing out for cigarettes and to walk the dog for that whole week, and all this stuff just came spilling out. And I thought, this is very interesting. So I made sure that every Friday, I only interviewed Bill on Fridays after that, because I thought it was a really interesting moment to capture somebody. And our conversations basically covered everything. It covered Bill's life history as somebody who's HIV positive, his work as a male prostitute, which he gave up. It covered Proust and classical music, because Bill is a classical pianist. And it covered questions about the universality or otherwise of death. And this ensuing discussion about the universality or otherwise of death is something we're going to come back to at the moment. Now, in Bill's life, he started to, at this stage of his life, he started to paint these kinds of paintings here. And he imagined that every painting was going to be his last painting. So he didn't have time to do preparatory work. If there was mistakes in it, he would leave them. Bill said he started in the middle of each painting, and he wanted to put everything into every painting in case it was his last one. So the immediacy of time meant he wasn't going to hang around making sketches and so forth, and any mistakes had to be in there. Each painting was conceived of as his last painting. And here's another one. And here's another one. Now, the fact of Bill's survival did not make it any more likely that he was going to survive. Actually, it was the opposite in his mind. So the fact that he'd already lived 6 months meant it was even more certain that he was going to die. And so there's kind of morbid intensity and compression of symbols in each of these paintings. Now, I've given something of the kind of life history. After Bill started painting these, or around this time, he had a very severe reaction to the medications he was taking, and he nearly died. And he said when he got close to death, when he actually came up close to it, it seemed entirely natural. It seemed as though it was like being born, and it no longer held the kind of fear and morbid angst that is present in these paintings. And after this, paintings became much more pop art. And Bill told me he wasn't sure if these paintings were any good or not, but he'd lost the urgency to paint these kinds of things. But still, these were a testament to a particular moment in his life. Again, to return to Heidegger, Heidegger says the world is not disclosed neutrally. There is no neutral, it's only disclosed to a specific state of mind. So walking down Oxford Road, you don't see Oxford Road in a kind of neutral sense. You see it through a particular state of mind, a particular mood, where one day it can look great and another day it might not. So this is representative of a kind of particular state of mind. And Bill suggested that this encounter with mortality, and this is a thing we had long discussions on and we disagreed with, that these encounters with mortality gave him some kind of access to some universal truth about death, which I thought was very interesting. And so, because I was going back to do fieldwork in Uganda, I took a lot of Bill's images to Uganda with me, and I went to Macrel University, where a friend of mine, Lillian Nabalimi, was head of art, and I asked, can I teach a couple of your classes? And she said, yes, fine. And I divided the class up into two. And one class I said, oh, here's some paintings from New York. There was Bill's and there was other people's. What do you think about them? I didn't give them any of the life history, and they interpreted these paintings. The other class, I gave the life history and asked them to interpret. And then it was quite interesting to see the extent to which the paintings that had no narrative that surrounded them, other than that they were from artists in New York, and the people who had been told about the circumstances of their production, the commonalities and discrepancies between those things. But what both sides were unanimous about was this was a man whose mind was full of death. So to that extent, Bill was correct. But to another extent, Bill was not correct, because people in Uganda, this is a symbol here, for example, slightly decaying, foreboding house. This was seen as paradise. So after death, you go to here, paradise, because it's not made out of mud, it has a decent ceiling, etc., etc. So there is a different form of cultural interpretation that's happening there. Anyway, so that was 1999. I return in the year 2000 to go back to see Bill and tell him about the comments that the people in Uganda had made about his paintings. But the whole summer I was there, Bill wasn't there. I couldn't find him. I phoned him. I emailed him. I went round to his house and Bill wasn't there. I went back in 2001. Bill wasn't there. Went back in 2003. Bill wasn't there. He wasn't there in 2004. Back in 2005. By now, I assume he's dead, because we're well into the era of Google, and there's still no mention of Bill. And you would have imagined, because his paintings were culturally quite important, that somewhere someone would be writing about his paintings, but still no Bill. 2006, Bill's not there. 2007, he's not there. 2008, Bill's not there. 2009, I received a grant from the Venegren to track down all the people I'd worked with in the 90s in New York to find out what happened to them. Because when I started working with these people, the idea was this was people who were approaching mortality. And then, with the arrival of antiretroviral medications, suddenly there's this massive shift away from death towards life. Only you can't make that adjustment so simple. You've made decisions about your life. You've taken yourself out of university. You've made all kinds of career decisions based on the fact you're going to die. And suddenly you have to learn how to live again. To a certain extent, you've been thrown out of capitalism. You no longer have to play by the rules. You can take out bank accounts without having to pay it back. But then once antiretroviral medications came out, you're going to live again, and you're back in capitalism. Anyway, so I tried to track down all the people that I'd worked with, all the surviving people, and one of those, of course, was Bill, but Bill wasn't there. 2010, I go back, Bill's not there. I found Bill in 2011, and Bill had been in prison serving an 8-year sentence for dealing crystal meth. So Bill had been caught by a sting by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, whereby he'd been doing a bit of small dealing just to get by and support his own habit of his own addiction. And this has its roots in the fact of not having very long to live. So, you don't necessarily have to think about long-term consequences of a very dangerous substance like crystal meth. And then Bill got addicted to it, and then he's small-time dealing, and then he wanted to quit. And a friend of his suggested to Bill to come in with him and do a big deal. Now, what Bill didn't know is that the friend had already been caught by the DEA, and they told him, look, if you give us all your contacts and set them up, we will reduce your sentence. And so he told Bill, come round to meet these people. We've got this big $30,000 deal. And Bill's thinking, great, for $30,000 I can go to Bermuda, get out of New York, get away from the drugs. I can spend the whole year and clean up my act. Of course, the two people he met were DEA agents. So he sold them, and the result was that he got 8 years, I think, in federal prison. One of the upsides of this is, as a result, Bill is better read than any of us, having read the complete volumes of Proust, Tristram Shandy. He also ended up an expert in German politics. And it coincided with a new policy, which I'm showing here, where posters of dealers were posted around the actual neighbourhoods where the dealing took place. So Bill then became part and parcel of the local environment. Now, I would like to introduce Bill to you because he should be on Skype. So I'm going to hand over him to do the next section of the paper, which is a kind of ethnographic section in which Bill's going to relate to us an ethnography of the US federal prison system as an insider, as somebody who was for many years subject to its regimes and mechanisms and power. Now, unfortunately, we've had a few technical problems with the university's thing, so I'm going to try and play Bill through my speakers here. So, Bill, are you there?
Yes, yes.
Okay, the sound is not particularly great, unfortunately.
Okay.
But I think people can you hear him at the back? Okay, but they can hear you. So Bill's now going to give us an ethnography of the prison for the next 15 or 20 minutes before I conclude. Okay, over to you, Bill.
Hi. Okay. The first thing that happens when you are arrested is you're handcuffed and shackled and put in a bus and driven out to Brooklyn to a facility, a concrete facility, and the bus is put in an elevator and you go down into the bowels of the building, and all of us are then ushered out onto a ramp. The shackles are taken off, our clothes are removed, and we're given jumpsuits. And at the time, we're also given numbers. And the numbers are our numbers that we have to use whenever we're spoken to. Mine was 55552-054. And it's all part of the prison system's policy of dehumanization, reducing you to a number, making it very clear from the very beginning that you don't count as an individual. And it's really very effective. I mean, it's very difficult to sort of fight against this commonality that you have with all of your fellow prisoners and the staff. So then we're just ushered into different cells and processed, and ultimately we end up in our own cell in the prison. It's interesting that there develops I mean, it seems obvious, I suppose. There develops this idea that it's an us against them system where inmates, regardless of socioeconomic status, are part of one unit, and we are opposed to the administration, which would be the guards and all of the counselors and all the people involved in running the prison. It was interesting that because there are several orders of people who are in federal prison. They're white-collar criminals who are generally all white and college-educated and, you know, have come from a high economic status and come in with a certain amount of sense of entitlement, which they're generally disabused of fairly quickly. Because they don't get special privileges because of their status. Then there are the rest of us, and most of the rest of us are there on drugs. It's about a third white, a third Spanish, and a third black. And part of my daily ritual, I was in a camp, which is the lowest, ultimately I was in a camp, but for the first 2 years I was in high security prisons. I was moving around a lot and ultimately ended up in a camp, which is the lowest intensity prison available. There are no fences. You have freedom of movement, which is not true in the higher level institutions, where you have 10-minute moves. Every hour there's 10 minutes you can move from one place to another, and then you have to stay in that place for 50 minutes before you can move again. In a camp, you have freedom of movement. You can move. You can pretty much come and go as you please, with certain exceptions. One of my favorite things to do was in the morning, I would wake up before the sun came up and I would go out to a place where the guards couldn't see me, and I would smoke cigarettes and drink coffee and watch the sun come up. And one of the most remarkable things was that I had lived in New York City for a long time and wasn't really aware of nature. And this camp was in the middle of 1,000 acres of hayfields. So I was able to watch the sun come up every morning and see the rotation of the earth and just how far it goes. It was kind of remarkable to me. That was one of the lovely things about it. But then you get to the structure of the prison where there's a certain time and a certain way that you go to meals, which we call chow. And you had to be called by your building, and you had to go in line, and you ate whatever was given you. And it became just a matter of, it became my life. It was actually, in the end, I mean, it turned out that it was actually kind of comforting to have that kind of ritual, that kind of surety. There was no decision to be made. It was as it was. And one of the things that developed in the prison, because we weren't allowed money, the population was divided up into two groups, really. One group had people who sent money in, and the other group didn't. So the group that didn't have money sent in had to find ways to make money to do jobs that would earn some sort of an income so that they could get things off the commissary. And the commissary was a store that sold snacks and food items and toiletries and clothes. So it was kind of necessary to have some sort of an income while you were there. The prison provided you with a jumpsuit and 4 pair of underwear, and that was all you got. You got 4 pair of socks, 4 pair of underwear, 4 t-shirts, and so if you wanted, and a pair of steel-toed boots. So if you wanted anything other than that, you had to have money to buy from the commissary. And the way that people who didn't have money were able to get things from the commissary was by doing chores for the inmates who had money. So if you wanted, and we used mackerels, packets of mackerels, they're fillets of mackerels in oil, and they were the currency. People ate them. There were actually 2 kinds of mackerels. There were money macks and there were regular eating macks. And the difference was that a money mac was a packet of mackerel that had been passed around so often that the fillets had been broken up into mush and weren't really fit to eat. So we used mackerels. We also would occasionally use stamps, but in some prisons, stamps is the currency. But in many prisons, mackerels. In fact, the company that makes the mackerels tried to make them for the general population, and no one would buy them. So they're made specifically for the prison system. The prison system is the only place where you can buy these packets of mackerel. I smuggled one out when I left so that I could make the painting of it. So say you wanted your laundry done. Your laundry could be done once a week for 3 mackerels, or your cube could be cleaned for 5 mackerels. They would do the floor. A cigarette cost 1 mackerel. And that was people's jobs. They would do these jobs. They would collect the mackerels. They would sell the mackerels to gamblers who would then buy commissary for them. It's a kind of complicated system, but it worked, and it worked well. And in the end, and I suspect it's still true, inflation sort of took place, because when I got there, mackerels were $1 on the commissary. By the time I left, they were $1.40. So you were paying $1.40 for a product that would only allow you $1 value. Like you weren't getting a cigarette and a half for your mackerel, you were still only getting one cigarette. I suspect if it gets to $2, then maybe some sort of change will take place, but I don't know about that, and I don't want to know about that.
All right, Bill, I think we've got about 20 minutes left now, so if I conclude, and then Bill's going to stay around for the questions. So if you have questions for either me or Bill, he'll be around in about 20 minutes' time. Okay, so this idea of mackerel economy, mackerel or macs, as Bill suggests, can be used for, to get a haircut, to get your hair close pressed, to be exchanged for pieces of fruit, for sexual favours as poker chips, and so forth. And there's been a mackerel economy in US federal prisons since about 2004, when the federal prisons prohibited smoking. And by default, cigarettes, which were the previous gold standard, became mackerel. Now, prisoners need a proxy for the dollar because money is not allowed in the prison. So, if you get sent money, as Bill was saying, it goes into a commissary account. You never actually see money. Nobody in the prison sees money. It goes into an account which you can buy things such as toiletries. So here's a kind, it's an electronic system. Now, the mackerel supplier, Global Source Marketing, says demand has obviously grown since 2004 and now accounts for half their sales. It outstrips their sales of tuna, crab, chicken and oysters. And also, because Bill was inside during the financial crisis that was outside, dollars lost their value. And because dollars lost their value on the outside, mackerel started increasing. So mackerel was a more stable economy than dollars. And it, as Bill says, it's up to 140, which is kind of close to what the British pound is. So it's kind of now edging towards an equivalence with the pound. Now, a problem with mackerels is that once the prisoner's sentence is up, there's little that can be done. They can't be redeemed for cash. They've got no value on the outside. So this kind of distorts the economy, and prisoners approaching their release must either barter or give away their stockpiles. Now, the ability to assign a shared social value to prison substances that recorded the status of money is located primarily in the mind and cognitive capacity for constructing a kind of shared meaning rather than materiality of the substance itself that's being used for money. So the materiality of money, as anthropologists have shown, in terms of teeth, shells, paper, whatever, often it's substances with little practical utility. And it's the imagination that has to invest meaning into certain materials and according then the status of being valuable. Money, Norman O'Brien suggests, is inorganic dead matter which has been made alive by inheriting the magic power which infantile narcissism attributes to the excremental product, i.e. shit. Such an activity predisposes a knowledge and faith and belief in substance, as well as in cultured society, something that is perhaps best summarised by George Santayana's discrimination between the properties of objects that exist independent of perception, i.e. existence, and the essence that is attributed to them by the capacity of the human mind, i.e. subsistence. But as we can never be sure, we can never be certain that the attributed essence actually inheres in the object itself, whether, i.e. they're worthless or not, doubt and scepticism emerge, and this uncertainty must be balanced by a kind of pragmatic animal faith that is necessary for this system to work. For Santayana, all knowledge, being faith in an object posited and partially described, is a belief in substance. In the etymological sense of this word, it is a belief in a thing or an event subsisting on its own plane and waiting for the light of knowledge to explore it eventually and perhaps name or define it. So once named, money reflects and encourages a kind of thinking, this is simul, that is simultaneously based in substance and sign. It's both objective and abstract. It's a type of thinking that is impersonal and qualitative. So this is why material substance that are worthless, perhaps even horrible tasting. Did you ever taste those Macrel, Bill?
Yeah, they're not terrible.
They're not terrible. Okay.
They're not terrible.
Okay. Rather than being the ultimate expression of secular reason and rationality, requires faith and imagination. So the transubstantiation of Macrel into money involves the same process that allows an object to be turned into art, namely the imaginative capacity to attach meaning to materiality so that it gains a value that exceeds that of the substance it's made of. So one of the most outrageous transubstantiations, artistic transformations, was obviously Duchamp's conversion of a urinal into art. For Sartre, this type of imaginative capacity is not a simple variant of thought and perception, but it's a distinct form of consciousness that encompasses both the act of imagining and the diverse worlds that the imagination brings into being. As such, it is the imagination as much as the materiality that brings art in together. When I look at a drawing, Sartre says, I posit in that very look a world of human intentions of which that drawing is a product, and for the image to appear, the cooperation of my consciousness is necessary. But the artist knows this, counts on it, the artist solicits this cooperation. So prison money too requires the cooperation of different consciousnesses to assign a shared value, meaning and significance to specific material forms. Now this does not mean all prisoners accord the same value or status to Macrel, because value is precisely constituted by the differences in play between objects and signs, but there nevertheless exists a shared social context in which the relative values of oily fish can emerge and become negotiated. So on this reading, money in this term Macrel, is an aggregation of mind, the conditions of incarceration brought about by the federal prison system, and the substance of Macrel, recalling the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke's notion of mankind having consented to put an imaginary value, that's his own words, upon gold and silver. So again, it involves a type of animism in which there's a tendency to ascribe moral values that are not inherent in the substance itself. However, the value of Macrel in economies of social exchange in prison are necessarily and partly hidden from authority. So Macs are known about, but they're invisible. So Macs are not an officially sanctioned currency, and penalties can be levied which keeps them from view. But even on the outside, Macrel, money is also highly invisible, in that when we see it or we catch a glimpse of it, money being exchanged, it very soon disappears into pockets, to tills, it enters into a deferred system where there is no ultimate reality or object or guaranteed value, no place to rest or settle or to be seen, simply an endless exchange and circulation of abstract signs. Marx, of course, said a commodity must quit its bodily shape, must transform itself from mere imaginary into real gold. Although the commodity, such transubstantiation may be more difficult than to the Hegelian concept, the transition from necessity to freedom, or the lobster to the casting of its shell, or to St. Jerome, the putting off of the old Adam. We might also think about this in Patti Smith's terms, in the lyrics to 25th Floor High and Rebellion, which came out in 1977. And she says, the transformation of waste is perhaps, or she sings rather, says, the transformation of waste is perhaps the oldest preoccupation of man. Man being the chosen alloy, he must be reconnected via shit at all costs inherent within us, is the dream of the task of the alchemist to create from the clay of man and to recreate from the excretion of man pure and then soft and then solid gold. So such acts of transubstantiation and transformation cannot exist without the human mind. The complexities are such that Locke, Hegel and Collingwood represent a line of philosophical thought in which the impossibility of defining, let alone understanding, the complexity of what mind is, because you can't define what mind is because mind is changing all the time. If you define it in one moment, in the next moment it's something different. So the complexity of defining what mind is has shifted the focus of explanation from definition to function. So that is to say, you're not asking what mind is, but rather observing what mind does. And this removes us from considering the nature and essence and ontology of human thinking, and instead invites an empirical investigation into observable human behaviour, function and action. Now, Collingwood summarises how such a study of mind involves two methodological renunciations. First, he says it renounces with John Locke the science of substance. It does not ask what mind is, it only asks what mind does. Secondly, it renounces all attempt to discover what mind always and everywhere does, and only asks what mind has done on certain definite occasions. So when extending this analysis from mind to money, Locke himself sided against ascribing an essential materiality to money and argued that the material body of money was not only worthless but irrelevant. The 19th century economist Francis Amasai Walker was following in Locke's line of reasoning when he argued that social theorists should not investigate what money is and instead proclaim that money is what money does. And what money does is to act as a medium of exchange, a store of value, a means of unilateral payment, of settlement, and a measure of value or unit of account. But by avoiding mind, and by avoiding what goes on in people's head, and instead observing the social conventions that exist outside of the head, Walker set the tone for 20th century economists and anthropologists and philosophers to abandon the metaphysics of money and reduce the complexity of people's relationship with it into simple descriptions of function. Monetary value here is seen as self-evident, material and tangible, a substance that can be stored, passed on, exchanged, given away, whose meaning is negotiated in relationships, da-da-da-da-da-da. As we've seen, all around the world, from the coolering or whatever to Wall Street. However, like many ontological inquiries or functionalist answers, this leaves many of the essential and most interesting questions unanswered. Consequently, any examination of money needs to be cast through an ethnography of particular lives in action, the lives that we've seen today, in their phenomenological and existential realities, whereby in-depth analysis of bodily difference might open up new avenues of exploration or stretch existing ones, in this case a prisoner's body with HIV. Now, to conclude, Bill's artwork of Macrel reveals just how different his life would have been had he remained at large, and draws attention to the fact there's no such thing as a pure life experience, only experiences that are imagined in relation to other possible lives that one could have lived. Recalling Clifford Geertz's assertion, I don't know if I've put this on the PowerPoint. No, I haven't. Recalling Clifford Geertz's assertion in The Interpretation of Cultures that, and I quote, "One of the most significant facts about us is the fact we all begin with the natural equipment to live 1,000 lives, but we end up, in the end, having only lived one." So the radical discrepancy between the actual life somebody lives and the myriad possible lives they could have lived exposes the fundamental contingency of being and how it's played out within a series of social and practical contexts. The alternative imagined life, in this case Bill's life on the inside now or the outside then, in which each is a framework for understanding the other, offers a moral framework for interpreting the meaning of events and for thinking about the different possibilities and perspectives through which people are able to theorise, understand and contextualise their thoughts and feelings and concerning their present circumstances. As such, people's imaginative life worlds and streams of reverie in their daydreams and so forth are not abstract or wishful fantasies, but a constitutive of people's material lives and embodied experiences of being in the world. This means that rather than thinking about a person's life biography as having a kind of essential or factual content, for a true understanding of their circumstances, it's necessary to take the lives of the imagination that they reconstruct at the daily basis and form the moral framework for understanding who they are. So incarceration confuses but does not threaten this distinction. And we can think here of Genet's writings. So Genet was incarcerated, but he's writing about every night his prison cell is populated by different characters. So I would argue that Macrel's reversal of value on the inside, as opposed to the outside, because nobody wants to buy it on the outside, actually represents a confusion of phenomenological relations, not just between the material and the imaginary, which is the one I've been trying to push, but also concerning the relative moral and ethical values according to different kinds of material substance, including the living but incarcerated human body and discarded dead body of Macrel. This is a drastic reversal of value in which dollars are recorded a lesser value than max, and it's symptomatic of a deeper-seated uncertainty in which knowledge, faith and belief in the substance of money is called into question. At the heart lies the age-old confusion of the animate over the inanimate, of death over life. So, to conclude, I will, if I can find it. Okay, to conclude with a quote from Norman O'Brien. What the elegant laws of supply and demand really describe is the antics of an animal that's confused excrement with ailment and does not know it, and which, like infantile sexuality, pursues no real aim. Having no real aim, acquisitiveness, as Aristotle correctly said, has no limit. Hence the psychological premise of a market economy is not, as in classical theory of exchange, the agents know what they want, but they do not know they want. So here lies an uncertainty and misunderstanding concerning the moral and ontological status of material substances that's played out with tragic consequences in the US prison system, in which human beings are surplus. So human beings are surplus by unnecessary, they're unneeded, so they go into prison. That is to say, certain types of human body, like money itself, are recorded as status of waste, of excrement, of shit. That's when Rousseau asks in his essay on the origin of languages how people might find it possible to empathise with others, who replies, in transporting ourselves out of ourselves, by identifying with the person who suffers. If the mental tools of sympathy can take the difference out of other people, the moral effect is one of displacement of oneself. And Rousseau goes on, we moderns have lost in imagination what we have gained in knowledge. We're incapable because of that knowledge of durable calcation. So, to return to Bill's paintings, I want to leave you with this picture of Bill's most recent painting, and I want to ask the same kind of question. What kind of things go on behind this painting, in the way that what kind of images go on behind Macrel? But I'm going to leave that as an open question, because I want you to think about what kind of life might be necessary in order to have painted that painting. So the idea of prison as an industrial complex is something which I think Bill will speak better to, because we actually discussed this last week when we were talking about Skype. So Bill, do you want to talk about prison as an industrial complex, and it's like the relationship of the prison to its immediate social surroundings and maybe its broader social surroundings?
Sure. Prisons are really important to the economy of the area in which they're placed. When we do a census every 10 years, and in the census, the prisoners of the prison are counted as citizens of that particular county. And the point of the census is to establish representation in government. So for instance, my particular prison had 700 inmates, and so that was an extra 700 citizens for this particular rural county that would increase their representation in Congress and in the state legislature. There's a move to change that now, whereby prisoners will be counted in the next census from where they were arrested rather than where they reside. But the prisons are were used as economic stimulus. Back in 1991, there was a big push in the federal system to build prisons in rural areas, mostly by the Republican Party. And so they provide jobs and these census numbers. So they're really important to these particular rural areas which were underrepresented before, now have an extra legislature.
Okay, great, thanks. Could you hear all that question, Bill?
Can you restate it?
Basically, what the question is about the difference in your experience of time.
Yes.
And economy throughout, let's say, the last 20 years. Let's say from before antiretrovirals arrived, then how that was transformed through the stabilisation of health through antiretrovirals. So how does that affect your experience and perception of the world and your thinking about the future, I think, in particular?
Right. That's a big question. First of all, I mean, the antiretrovirals, I think it's a mistake to think of the antiretrovirals as this kind of Lazarus drug that's going to give you a normal lifespan. It's kind of the way that they're sold, and it's the way that I think the medical profession sells them. But the fact is that they're new drugs. We don't know what the long-term effects are. There are, like, for instance, I have degenerative arthritis in my spine, and I'm 56, and it's most likely from the drugs. So, and people get all sorts of like weird cancers and things. So the point is that I still don't see my lifespan as a normal one. I don't expect to be 70, for instance. I mean, I might be, but I still work on that 18-month to 2-year plan. I figure it's entirely possible that, something will happen. I'll have a heart attack. I'll have some sort of cancer. Something will happen, and I'll die.
Bill, why do you think Macrel has become the currency rather than something else? Is power involved in that, or is it completely arbitrary?
I think it was completely arbitrary. When Macrel cost $1 on the commissary, so it was easy to make the conversion, so that anything that would cost $1 on the outside could be paid for by a Macrel, because that's what a Macrel costs on the commissary.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. But I think I actually agree. Someone
talked about tuna. When the commissary ran out of mackerel, which it did from time to time, we would use tuna as a substitute. But mackerel was always the go-to substance for commerce.
Okay.
But basically, I think I agree with you, actually, Samuel. I think there are important differences that I haven't accounted for. I think, if I get the question, is that the spur was because cigarettes were banned. So that they had to...
Cigarettes were initially the currency. And when cigarettes were banned, then something had to be substituted, and it turned out to be Max.
And then the second part of that question is really about the power that mackerels allow you. And power also for violence and for control and all these other things. So, have you got anything to say about that?
There were certainly instances of violence in terms of, people collecting a large number of Macs and other people trying to steal them. But that's not really anything that's different than the outside world. I mean, those conditions existed in prison in the same way that they exist outside. You're walking down the street and you're mugged because the person doesn't have money and you do.
And how about the relationship with kind of social status and being the top dog or anything? Could that be achieved through the accumulation of Macs?
Oh, absolutely. They were Maconaires.
Which paintings? Oh, Bill, you're being asked to comment on the painting of the Toronto guy. Is it in Toronto with half a leg?
It's called Requiem for Lin Jun, and Lin Jun was the boyfriend of a porn star in Canada, and they were having rough sex, and Lin Jun died, and the porn star, being a psychopath, decided that he would make a video of him cutting up Lin Jun's body and sending the body parts to different Canadian political figures. And I found the video on YouTube and took the screenshot from it and sort of based the painting on that as a kind of, I'm doing a series on martyrs and political figures. So this kind of fit into the martyr category.
But I believe those legs are yours in there, Bill, aren't they? Isn't that
they are. Those are my feet.
Oh. Okay, thanks.
No. Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you, Bill, for your practice.